Jake Murphy wiped the sweat from his hands as he looked around the massive arena. He had never seen anything like this place before. The walls rose high into the sky, made of some kind of blue metal that seemed to glow in the alien sunlight. Thousands of seats filled with strange creatures from across the galaxy surrounded a circular fighting area in the center. "This is incredible," whispered Lisa Chen, the woman sitting next to him. She was also part of the human security team that had come to this world called Zentara Prime. Her dark eyes were wide as she stared at all the different alien species around them. Jake nodded but felt uneasy. Something about this whole event felt wrong to him. As a former Marine, he had learned to trust his instincts when danger was near. Today, those instincts were screaming at him. Ambassador Peter Clark sat a few rows behind them, dressed in his best diplomatic uniform. He had told the security team to stay quiet and watch. "This is their tradition," he had said during the briefing that morning. "We are here only to observe and learn about their culture." But Jake was having a hard time staying quiet as he watched what was happening below. In the center of the arena stood two figures that could not have been more different from each other. On one side was Queen Lyrillith of the Zephyrian people. She was tall and graceful, with pale blue skin that seemed to shine like starlight. Her people looked almost like humans, except for their pointed ears and the way they moved like dancers, even when standing still. The queen held two curved swords that looked more like pieces of art than weapons. On the other side of the arena stood something that looked like a nightmare. General Vorthak of the Korthak Dominion was huge, at least 9 feet tall and covered in thick dark scales. He had 4 powerful arms, each one holding a different weapon that crackled with deadly energy. His red eyes glowed with hate as he stared at the queen. "Why are they fighting?" Jake asked Lisa quietly. She checked the translation device they had all been given. "From what I understand, the Korthak Dominion wants to take over the Zephyrian Empire. But there's some old law that says disputes between rulers can be settled by single combat instead of war." Jake felt his hands form into fists. "So if she loses, her entire people become slaves?" "That's right," Lisa said sadly. "And look at the size of that thing she has to fight." Around them, the other alien species watched with what seemed like boredom. Jake saw creatures with tentacles instead of arms, beings made of what looked like living rock, and others that seemed to be made of pure energy floating in metal suits. None of them seemed to care that they were about to watch a young woman fight for the freedom of her people against impossible odds. "This isn't right," Jake muttered. "Quiet," hissed Ambassador Clark from behind them. "We cannot interfere. This is their way." A voice boomed across the arena, speaking in a language that sounded like music mixed with the howling of wind. The translation devices kicked in a second later. "By the ancient laws of combat trial, Queen Lyrillith of the Zephyrian Empire will face General Vorthak of the Korthak Dominion. The winner will decide the fate of both peoples. Let the combat begin." The crowd erupted in cheers and roars from dozens of different species. But Jake noticed that the section where the Zephyrians sat was completely silent. They watched their queen with fear and sadness in their large dark eyes. Queen Lyrillith raised her swords and moved forward with fluid grace. She was fast, Jake had to admit, but General Vorthak was a monster. His first swing with a massive war hammer nearly took her head off. She ducked just in time, but Jake could see that she was already breathing hard. The general laughed, a sound like grinding metal. He swung again with 2 of his arms while the other 2 aimed energy weapons at her. The queen dodged and weaved, but Jake could see she was fighting just to stay alive, not to win. "She's in trouble," Jake said, leaning forward in his seat. "There's nothing we can do," Lisa replied, but her voice was tight with worry. As the fight continued, Jake watched the general's attacks more carefully. His military training kicked in automatically. He began to see patterns in how the big alien moved, weaknesses that could be exploited if someone knew what to look for. The queen was brave, but she was fighting the way her people had probably fought for thousands of years. It was beautiful to watch, but it wasn't practical against a brutal enemy like this. She needed tactics, not tradition. Jake stood up without thinking. "Sit down," Ambassador Clark whispered urgently. "You'll cause a diplomatic incident." But Jake ignored him. He was watching the Queen stumble as one of the general's energy blasts grazed her shoulder. Blue blood ran down her arm, and she was getting slower with each passing minute. The Zephyrians in the crowd began to make soft, sad sounds that their translation devices couldn't convert. But Jake didn't need a translation to understand. They were watching their beloved leader die. "She's not going to make it," he said to Lisa. "I know," she replied quietly. "But what can we do? We're just humans. We don't belong in their fight." Jake looked around at all the alien faces watching the combat like it was entertainment. None of them cared that a good person was about to die. None of them were going to help. But Jake Murphy had spent his whole life helping people who couldn't help themselves. That's why he had joined the Marines. That's why he had taken this job protecting diplomats on dangerous worlds. And that's why he couldn't just sit there and watch this happen. The general landed another hit, and the Queen went, down on one knee. The crowd cheered louder. Jake made his decision. Queen Lyrillith tried to stand up, but her legs shook under her weight. The energy blast from General Vorthak's weapon had burned through her side, and she could feel her strength leaving her body like water through a broken dam. The general walked toward her slowly, enjoying every step. His forearms moved like a deadly dance as he spun his weapons. The crowd roared their approval, but to the Queen, it sounded like distant thunder. "Your people will make good slaves," Vorthak said in his grinding voice. "They are weak just like you." Lyrillith forced herself to stand straight. Even if she was going to die, she would not give this monster the satisfaction of seeing her beg. She raised her swords again, even though her arms felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. In the crowd, Jake Murphy felt his heart pounding. He had been in combat before, had seen good soldiers die, but this was different. This wasn't war between armies, this was murder dressed up as tradition. "Jake, don't do anything stupid," Lisa whispered, grabbing his arm. She knew that look in his eyes. It was the same look he got right before he did something brave and dangerous. Ambassador Clark was still hissing orders from behind them. "Sit down, Murphy, that's an order. We cannot interfere with their customs." But Jake wasn't listening to the ambassador anymore. He was watching the way the general moved, the way he telegraphed his attacks, the way he left himself open for just a split second after each swing. If the Queen could see what Jake was seeing, she might have a chance. The general attacked again, bringing down his warhammer with enough force to crack the arena floor. The Queen rolled away, but she was getting slower. Her blue blood left a trail behind her as she moved. "She's dying," Jake said quietly. Around them, the other alien species watched with cold interest. Some were taking bets on how much longer the Queen would last. Others were already discussing trade agreements with the Korthaks, assuming the general would win. The Zephyrians sat in their section like statues, their large eyes filled with tears that looked like liquid diamonds. They knew their Queen was fighting for all their lives, and there was nothing they could do to help her. General Vorthak grabbed the Queen by her long silver hair and lifted her off the ground with one massive hand. His other 3 arms prepared to finish her off. "Any last words before your people become my property?" he asked. Queen Lyrillith looked up at him with defiance burning in her eyes. "My people will never truly belong to anyone," she said. "Freedom lives in the heart, not in chains." The general laughed and raised his energy weapon to her head. That's when Jake Murphy jumped over the barrier. The entire arena fell silent. Tens of thousands of aliens stopped cheering, stopped talking, stopped even breathing for a moment. In Aite, the 1,000-year history of combat trials, no one had ever interfered with a sacred fight between rulers. Jake landed hard on the arena floor and rolled to absorb the impact, just like he had been trained to do in the Marines. He came up running toward the center of the fighting area. "Hey!" he shouted at the general. "Let her go." General Vorthak was so surprised that he actually dropped the Queen. She fell to the ground and crawled away, gasping for air. The general turned all 4 of his red eyes toward Jake. "What is this small creature?" he growled. Jake stopped about 10 feet away from the massive alien. Up close, Vorthak was even more terrifying. His scales looked like armor plating, and his weapons hummed with deadly energy. But Jake had faced scary enemies before. "I'm a human," Jake said simply. "And I'm telling you to fight fair." The crowd erupted in chaos. Some aliens were outraged that their sacred ceremony had been interrupted. Others were fascinated by the small being who dared to face the mighty general. The Zephyrians watched with something that might have been hope. Ambassador Clark was on his feet, shouting into his communication device. "This is a diplomatic disaster. Get me the Earth Council immediately." But Jake ignored all the noise around him. He was focused on the Queen, who was trying to get back to her feet. "You're fighting all wrong," he called out to her. "That big guy's strong, but he's slow, and he drops his guard every time he swings that hammer." Queen Lyrelith looked at Jake with surprise. No one had ever given her tactical advice in the middle of a fight before, but there was something in the human's eyes that made her trust him. "Watch his lower right arm," Jake continued, studying the general's movements. "He favors it when he's tired. That's your target." General Vorthak roared with rage. "This is interference. The trial is sacred." But the ancient laws were clear. As long as Jake didn't physically attack the general himself, he wasn't breaking any rules. Advice from the crowd was technically allowed, even if it had never happened before. The Queen stood up straighter, her pain forgotten for the moment. She looked at the general with new eyes, seeing the weaknesses that the human had pointed out. "Thank you," she said to Jake. "Don't thank me yet," Jake replied. "Just stay alive and listen to what I tell you." General Vorthak charged toward the Queen again, but this time she was ready. Following Jake's advice, she watched for the moment when the general would drop his guard. It came when he swung his massive warhammer in an overhead strike. For just a split second, his lower right side was exposed. "Now!" Jake shouted. The Queen struck like lightning, her sword finding the gap in the general's scales that Jake had spotted. The big alien roared in pain and stumbled backward. For the first time since the fight began, General Vorthak was the one who was bleeding. The crowd went wild. The Zephyrians began to cheer for their queen. Even some of the other alien species seemed impressed by this unexpected turn of events. But Jake knew the fight was far from over. The general was wounded but not defeated, and now he was angrier than ever. "Stay focused," Jake called to the Queen. "He's going to try to rush you now. When he does, go low and to your left." Queen Lyrelith nodded and prepared for the general's next attack. For the first time since the trial began, she felt like she might actually have a chance to win. General Vorthak touched the wound on his side and looked at his own dark blood with disbelief. In all his years of fighting, very few enemies had ever managed to hurt him. The fact that this small queen had done it with help from an even smaller human filled him with rage. "You think your pet monkey can save you?" he snarled at Queen Lyrelith. "I will crush you both." Jake ignored the insult and kept his eyes on the general's movements. "He's angry now," he called to the Queen. "Angry. Fighters make mistakes. Stay calm and wait for your chance." The Queen wiped the blood from her face and steadied her breathing. The human was right. She had been trained to fight with grace and honor, but this was not a graceful fight. This was about survival, and the human seemed to understand that better than anyone. In the crowd, the reaction was mixed. The Zephyrians were cheering louder than they had in years, hope returning to their faces as they watched their queen hold her own against the mighty general. But other alien species were not happy about the interference. "This breaks 1,000 years of tradition," shouted a creature that looked like a giant insect. "The human must be removed." "The laws allow advice from spectators," argued another alien that seemed to be made of living crystal. "It has never happened before, but it is not forbidden." Ambassador Clark was having the worst day of his diplomatic career. His communicator was buzzing with angry messages from various alien governments, and he knew that Earth's reputation in this part of the galaxy might be ruined forever. But Lisa Chen was watching the fight with growing excitement. "Go, Jake," she whispered. "Show them what humans can do." Down in the arena, General Vorthak was preparing for another attack. He had learned from his mistake and was being more careful with his guard. But Jake had fought against careful enemies before. "Queen, listen to me," Jake called out. "He's going to try to corner you against the wall. When he does, use the wall to push off and get behind him. His weapons can't turn around fast enough to follow you. The general charged forward, trying to drive the queen backward toward the arena wall, just as Jake had predicted. But instead of being trapped, Queen Lyraleth used the wall exactly as the human had suggested. She pushed off with her feet and flipped over the general's head, landing behind him. Before Vorthak could turn around, she struck again, this time hitting the back of his knee. The general stumbled and went down on one knee himself. The crowd was going crazy now. Even aliens who didn't care about the outcome were impressed by the tactical brilliance being displayed. They had never seen anything like this combination of human military thinking and Zephyrian combat skill. "She's actually got a chance," Lisa said, grabbing Jake's arm in excitement. But Jake knew they weren't done yet. The general was hurt, but he was still dangerous. And now other problems were starting. Some of the Korthak representatives in the crowd were shouting about the unfairness of outside help. They were demanding that the trial be stopped and restarted without interference. "Human must be silenced," roared one of them. Ambassador Clark stood up and tried to restore order. "The ancient laws clearly state that advice from spectators is allowed," he said, reading from his diplomatic handbook. "My security officer has not broken any rules." But the Korthaks weren't interested in following laws that didn't help them win. Several of their warriors began moving toward the arena, intending to remove Jake by force. Lisa saw them coming and made a decision. She pulled out her emergency beacon and activated it, sending a signal to the human ship in orbit above. "The planet, what are you doing?" Ambassador Clark asked her. "Making sure Jake doesn't face this alone," she replied. Back in the arena, Queen Lyraleth and General Vorthak circled each other like predators. The general was bleeding from several wounds now, but he was still much stronger than the queen. "Your human friend has taught you some new tricks," Vorthak admitted. "But tricks will not save you when I crush your bones to dust." He attacked with all four arms at once, a whirlwind of weapons that would have torn apart any normal opponent. But the queen was no longer fighting like a normal opponent. She was fighting like someone who had learned from the best military mind in the arena. "Roll left, then strike high," Jake shouted. The queen followed his instructions perfectly, avoiding the general's attack and landing another hit on his shoulder. But this time, Vorthak was ready for her. He grabbed her sword with one of his hands and twisted it away from her. Now Queen Lyraleth had only one weapon left, while the general still had four. "That's okay," Jake called out, his voice steady despite the danger. "You're faster than him. Speed beats strength if you use it right." But before the queen could respond, the Korthak warriors reached the edge of the arena. They pointed their weapons at Jake, ready to eliminate the human who had dared to interfere with their general's victory. "Step away from the combat area. Human," one of them ordered. "Your interference ends now." Jake looked up at them and smiled grimly. "I don't think so." That's when the first human reinforcements arrived. Lisa's emergency beacon had worked faster than anyone expected. 3 more human security officers came running into the arena, their weapons drawn and ready for trouble. "Nobody moves," shouted one of them. "This human is under diplomatic protection." The situation was getting out of control. Weapons were being pointed in all directions, and it looked like the sacred combat trial might turn into an all-out battle between different species. But Jake never took his eyes off the fight in the center of the arena. He knew that Queen Lyraleth's life and the freedom of her entire people still hung in the balance. "Queen," he called out as General Vorthak prepared for what might be his final attack. "Remember what I told you about his energy weapons. They need time to recharge after a big blast. If you can make him use them all at once." Queen Lyraleth understood immediately. She began moving in a pattern that would force the general to fire all his energy weapons at the same time. It was dangerous, but it was also their best chance. General Vorthak took the bait. He fired all his weapons at once, filling the air with deadly energy bolts. The queen barely escaped the attack, diving and rolling as the energy blasts scorched the ground where she had been standing. But now all of the general's weapons were recharging, and he had nothing but his physical strength to fight with. "Now," Jake shouted, "while he's vulnerable." Queen Lyraleth charged forward with her remaining sword, moving faster than she ever had in her life. This was her moment, and she wasn't going to waste it. Queen Lyrillith moved like lightning across the arena floor. Her remaining sword gleamed in the alien sunlight as she closed the distance between herself and General Vorthak. For the first time in the entire fight, she was the one attacking while he was defending. The general tried to block her strike with his massive arms, but without his energy weapons, he was slower than before. The queen's blade found its mark, cutting deep into his chest. Dark blood poured from the wound, and Vorthak roared in pain and fury. "Impossible," he bellowed. "I am the greatest warrior in the Korthak Dominion. I cannot be defeated by a weak little queen." But Jake could see that the tide of battle had truly turned. The general was weakening with each passing second, while the queen seemed to grow stronger as she finally gained the upper hand. "Keep the pressure on him," Jake shouted from the sidelines. "Don't give him time to recover." The security officers from both species were still pointing weapons at each other around the edge of the arena, but everyone's attention was focused on the dramatic fight taking place in the center. Even the Korthak warriors had stopped trying to remove Jake, too caught up in watching their champion struggle against an opponent they had thought would be easy to defeat. Queen Lyrillith pressed her attack, using every technique Jake had taught her. She stayed mobile, struck at weak points, and never let the general set the pace of the fight. Her sword work was like a deadly dance, beautiful and terrifying at the same time. General Vorthak was getting desperate. He could feel his strength leaving him, and for the first time in his life he was afraid he might actually lose. In his desperation, he tried a move that broke the ancient rules of combat trial. He grabbed a handful of sand from the arena floor and threw it in the queen's eyes. The crowd gasped. Even in trial by combat, there were some things that were not allowed. Blinding your opponent with dirt was one of them. Queen Lyrillith stumbled backward, her eyes streaming with tears as she tried to clear the sand. She was temporarily helpless, and everyone knew it. General Vorthak raised his warhammer for what he intended to be the killing blow. "Die, you pathetic creature." But Jake had seen the sand attack coming and was already moving. He jumped down from the raised platform where he had been standing and slid across the arena floor, arriving just in time to kick the general's legs out from under him. Vorthak crashed to the ground, his hammer flying from his grasp. He looked up at Jake with confusion and rage. "You cannot touch me, human," he snarled. "The laws forbid it." Jake stood over the fallen general, his own anger burning bright. "The laws also forbid throwing sand in your opponent's eyes," he said. "You broke the rules first, so now all bets are off." The crowd was in complete chaos now. Some aliens were screaming about violations of sacred law. Others were cheering for the humans who had turned the fight around. The Zephyrians were singing victory songs even though the battle wasn't over yet. Ambassador Clark had given up trying to control the situation. He just sat in his seat with his head in his hands, knowing that his diplomatic career was probably over. But Lisa Chen was cheering louder than anyone. "That's our Jake!" she shouted. "Show them what humans are made of!" Down in the arena, Queen Lyrillith had managed to clear the sand from her eyes. She could see again, and what she saw was Jake standing protectively between her and the general. "You have given me more than tactical advice," she said to him. "You have shown me what true courage looks like." Jake smiled at her. "Just finish this fight, Your Majesty. Your people are counting on you." General Vorthak tried to get back to his feet, but his wounds were too severe. He collapsed again, his massive body shaking with exhaustion and blood loss. Queen Lyrillith walked over to where her enemy lay helpless. She could have killed him easily with one strike of her sword. By the laws of combat trial, she had every right to end his life. But instead she placed the point of her blade at his throat and spoke in a clear voice that carried throughout the arena. "General Vorthak of the Korthak Dominion, you are defeated. Do you yield?" The general looked up at her with hatred in his red eyes, but he knew he had lost. His body was broken, his weapons were scattered across the arena floor, and his strength was gone. "I yield," he whispered, the words tasting like poison in his mouth. The arena erupted in the loudest cheer it had heard in centuries. Queen Lyrillith had won the trial by combat. The Zephyrian Empire would remain free, and the Korthak Dominion would have to withdraw their claims. But Jake knew that this victory was about more than just saving one species from slavery. Something bigger had happened here today. The other alien species in the crowd were looking at humans with new respect, and some with new fear. A small group of beings from Earth had just changed the outcome of a conflict that would affect entire star systems. They had shown that humans were not the primitive creatures that everyone thought they were. Ambassador Clark finally stood up, realizing that maybe this diplomatic disaster might actually turn into a diplomatic triumph. "Ladies and gentlemen, beings of all species," he announced through the arena's communication system. "Today you have witnessed the courage and tactical brilliance of humanity. We offer these same qualities in friendship to all peaceful races." Queen. Lyralith walked over to Jake and did something that surprised everyone in the arena. She knelt down on one knee in front of the human, a gesture of deep respect that no alien ruler had ever shown to someone from Earth. "Jake Murphy of Earth," she said formally, "you have saved not just my life, but the freedom of my entire people. The Zephyrian Empire owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Jake felt embarrassed by all the attention, but he helped the Queen to her feet. "You did all the fighting, Your Majesty. I just gave you a few tips." The Queen smiled, and when she smiled, her whole face seemed to glow with inner light. "Those tips made all the difference. Would you consider staying on Zentara Prime as my military advisor?" Jake looked up at the thousands of alien faces staring down at them. Some looked friendly, others looked suspicious, and a few looked downright hostile. But all of them were looking at humans with new interest. He thought about his quiet life back on Earth, and then he thought about all the good he might be able to do in this strange new galaxy, full of different species and ancient conflicts. "I'll have to think about it," he said finally. "But I'm definitely interested." As medical teams rushed onto the arena floor to treat both fighters, Jake realized that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than anyone had planned. 3 months had passed since the trial by combat that changed everything. Jake Murphy stood on the observation deck of the new joint human Zephyrian space station, watching ships from both Earth and Zentara Prime working together on patrol missions. It still amazed him how much had changed in such a short time. Queen Lyralith joined him at the large window, her wounds from the fight completely healed. She now wore a mix of traditional Zephyrian robes and practical human military gear, a symbol of how the two species had learned to combine their strengths. "The third training class graduated yesterday," she told Jake. 50 Zephyrian officers now understand human tactical thinking, and 50 human officers have learned our traditional combat arts. Jake nodded with satisfaction. The Joint Military Academy had been his idea, and it was working better than anyone had hoped. Young people from both species were learning from each other, creating new fighting techniques that were more effective than either race could develop alone. "Any word from the Korthak Dominion?" he asked. The Queen's expression darkened slightly. "Our spies report that General Vorthak has been stripped of his rank and sent into exile. The new Korthak leadership is much more interested in peaceful trade than conquest. It seems they don't want to face the new human Zephyrian alliance in battle." Jake smiled at that. Word of what happened in the arena had spread across the galaxy faster than light speed. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know more about these humans who had helped a queen defeat an unbeatable enemy through clever tactics and moral courage. Ambassador Clark walked up to join them, looking much happier than he had on that dramatic day, 3 months ago. Instead of being fired for allowing the diplomatic incident, he had been promoted for helping to establish the most important new alliance in this part of the galaxy. "Jake, I just received word from Earth," Clark said, holding up his communication device. "The President wants to offer you the Medal of Galactic Service. You would be the first human to receive it." Jake shrugged. "Tell him thanks, but I'm happy with what I'm doing here." That was true. Jake had never been more satisfied with his work. He spent his days training young officers from different species, helping to plan joint missions, and occasionally serving as a bodyguard when Queen Lyralith visited other worlds. Lisa Chen was working at a console nearby, coordinating the patrol schedules for human and Zephyrian ships. She had also decided to stay on Zentara Prime, finding the work much more interesting than anything Earth had to offer. "Jake, you need to see this," she called out, excitement clear in her voice. They all gathered around her screen, which showed a communication from a species none of them had ever seen before. The alien looked somewhat like a cross between a bird and a lizard with bright green feathers and intelligent golden eyes. "Greetings to the Human Zephyrian Alliance," the alien said through the universal translator. "I am Ambassador Karak of the Theron Republic. We have heard of your victory over the Korthax and your innovative approach to interspecies cooperation. We would like to request your assistance with a problem of our own." Queen Lyrolith looked at Jake with raised eyebrows. "It seems your reputation is spreading even further than we thought." Jake studied the alien on the screen. The Theron looked nervous and desperate, much like Queen Lyrolith had looked before her trial by combat. "What kind of problem?" he asked. "We are being threatened by the Nexus Collective," Ambassador Karak explained. "They demand that we surrender our homeworld or face total destruction. Our people are peaceful like the Zephyrians, and we do not have the military strength to resist them." "The Nexus Collective," Queen Lyrolith said quietly. "I've heard of them. They're even more ruthless than the Korthax." Jake felt that familiar feeling in his chest, the one that told him people needed help and he was in a position to provide it. "Tell Ambassador Karak that we'll be happy to meet with him and discuss options." Ambassador Clark looked worried. "Jake, we can't get involved in every conflict in the galaxy. Earth doesn't have unlimited resources." But Queen Lyrolith was already nodding in agreement with Jake. "The Alliance was founded on the principle of helping those who cannot help themselves," she said. "If we abandon that principle now, what are we really fighting for?" Jake thought about that day in the arena when he had watched thousands of alien beings sit quietly while an innocent woman was about to be murdered. He had jumped over that barrier because he couldn't stand by and watch injustice happen. Now, 3 months later, he realized that the choice was the same. He could play it safe and protect only what he already had, or he could take risks to help others who needed it. "Set up the meeting," he told Lisa. "Let's hear what the Therons have to say." Over the next few hours, they learned that the Theron Republic was facing the same kind of trial by combat that Queen Lyrolith had survived. But this time, the enemy was even stronger, and the Theron people had no warriors who could possibly win such a fight. "We will help," Queen Lyrolith announced without hesitation. "The Alliance stands ready to assist all peaceful species against those who would enslave them." Jake looked around the room at his friends and colleagues. Lisa was already pulling up star charts to plan the journey to Theron space. Ambassador Clark was drafting messages to Earth asking for additional ships and personnel. Queen Lyrolith was contacting her military commanders to prepare for another dangerous mission. They were all ready to risk their lives again to help people they had never met, simply because it was the right thing to do. As Jake watched them work, he realized that something important had happened that day in the arena. It wasn't just that one human had helped one alien queen win one fight. It was that the example had spread, inspiring others to act with the same courage and moral clarity. The alliance between humans and Zephyrians had become something bigger than either species could have achieved alone. It had become a beacon of hope for smaller, weaker races throughout the galaxy. A proof that bullies could be defeated when good people worked together. Jake looked out the window again at the patrol ships flying in perfect formation, humans and aliens working side by side to protect innocent lives. In the distance, he could see construction ships building new stations and defense platforms that would protect dozens of different species. "You know," he said to Queen Lyrolith, "I think we're just getting started." The Queen smiled, that radiant smile that had become famous throughout the galaxy. "I hope so, Jake Murphy. The universe has many people who need help, and we have proven that miracles are possible when someone is brave enough to stand up and act." As if to prove her point, Lisa's communication console lit up with 3 more requests for assistance, from species they had never heard of. Word was spreading that there was finally an alliance in the galaxy that cared more about doing what was right than about following old rules. Jake cracked his knuckles and grinned. It was going to be a busy few years, but he couldn't think of anything he'd rather be doing. Sometimes, he reflected, the most important moments in history start with one person deciding that they've seen enough injustice for one day. Everything else just follows from there. Outside the window, the stars stretched out in all directions, full of possibilities and people who might need their help. Jake Murphy, former Marine and security guard, now found himself at the center of a growing movement that was changing the way different species related to each other across the galaxy. It had all started when he couldn't bear to watch a good person die while others did nothing. Now it seemed like that same principle was spreading from world to world, inspiring other people to take risks for strangers and stand up for what was right. The arena had been just the beginning.